Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory, boring ancient history stories for sleep. Tonight, we're heading into the apocalypse, the ancient edition. No guns, no jeeps, no secret American laboratories, just a dull stone shovel, a few grains of barley, and your grandmother knocking on the tomb door from the inside. This isn't the zombie movie you've seen before. This is zombie Egypt, zombie Babylon, zombie Roman Empire, where the dead do not rest because no one dared to lift the lid to make sure they were really dead. So before you start feeling cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from across the world. Right now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a gentle humming sound, and let's step into tonight's journey together. No one knew exactly what happened during the royal embalming ceremony in Thebes that year. The high priest, the head of the ritual, had just anointed the dead forehead when that dry hand suddenly grabbed his. No curse was spoken. No sign from the gods, just a corpse, standing up as if it forgot it had died. Thebes, a morning without clouds, in the year 1260 before Christ, or thereabouts, when death was still a significant part of life. In the temple of Anubis, they were embalming a young prince. No one knew for sure if he died from illness or from politics. Only that he hadn't grown a beard yet, and had been carefully wrapped like a sacred cake. They sang, they chanted, they anointed with perfume. They placed the organs into 4 animal-headed jars, one for the liver, one for the lungs, one for the intestines, and one. No one remembers what it was for, but it always smelled strangely of mint. The high priest, a man who had embalmed over 200 corpses and never been sued, stepped forward and touched the forehead of the dead. A symbolic gesture, a farewell. And he chuckled softly, muttering like a joke to himself, "If you're planning on getting up, please don't bite my face." His hand hadn't yet pulled away. A servant behind recalled. At that moment, the oil lamps in the room flickered, and a strange scent spread, something like mint mixed with dead rat. No one had ever smelled anything so fresh yet so gut-wrenching. The corpse opened its eyes, not slowly, not dreamily, not half awake. It sat up like a scarab beetle that had been accidentally stepped on. Its right hand grabbed the priest's throat, not out of hatred, but out of hunger. A hunger as if it hadn't tasted living flesh in 1,000 years. One servant screamed, one fainted, one ran into a stone pillar and broke his own tooth. No one could stop it. No one understood. No curse had been misread, no omen from the gods, just a corpse that decided not to lie still. They called it a disturbance, then burned every written record, sealed the embalming workshop, and quietly made people disappear, one by one, except for a young apprentice, whom no one paid attention to. He hid under a stone table, trembling like a boiled shrimp. 3 years later, under a full moon, he woke, eyes wide, and scratched into the earthen wall with his fingernails. He didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't sleep. But he began to draw. Drawings unlike anything the adults had ever seen. A bloody hand, a headless shadow, and a door with no hinges. Each drawing had the same line of text, repeating like a fevered dream. They are looking for the organs. No one asked further. But that corpse didn't stay in Thebes. It left. No one saw it. No one dared to look. Only left behind a room cold as stone. And in the sand, something strange. Two sets of footprints. One small, light, like a child just coming of age. One deeper, even, unturning. But there had only been one corpse in the room, and the fourth organ jar had been opened. It went west, where there was light, hot baths, wine, and cities that believed they knew everything about life. And the first place it visited was Pompeii. Pompeii, the city of wine scent, hot sweat, and mispositioned nude statues. 3 days before it happened, the dogs in the city howled through the night. The Romans were used to the smell of blood, but not to dogs jumping into wells on their own. No one could explain it, only that, since that day, the square had no more barking. The ancient Romans lived as if death were a polite neighbor, always knocking before entering. And then the birds disappeared too. No sparrows, no pigeons, not even crows. The rooftops, once white with birds, now became suspiciously quiet. They said, even the statue of Jupiter in the square seemed to look up at the sky, for the first time in 300 years. They built bathhouses as big as theatres. They threw wine parties even on Mondays. They ate honey cakes with their fingers, and they never thought that death could walk in right when shaving. But it came. No knock, no announcement, just opened its eyes and walked in like it owned the place. The first bitten was a potter. He was having breakfast, a pastry and a cup of warm wine. His wife said he woke up late. He was about to reply when he realized she had no eyes, just two deep black holes oozing honey, or something you shouldn't eat with cake. It spread like fire meeting oil. The upper class blamed the slaves blamed Pluto. The priests held prayer, then bit each other right on the altar. No one understood what was happening. Some nobles died because they refused to take off their genuine leather belts. Some died arguing about civil rights while running. They died as they lived, entangled in the very things they took pride in. But the Romans still held one unwavering belief. Even if the world collapsed, they would shave their legs clean before fleeing. They died standing, eyes open, and many were found still holding their tax ledgers. Pompeii had once been a symbol of civilization, of underground sewers, of oil lamps at night, of unshamed sexuality and hot water running through pipes. But now, it was only hallways soaked in rust smell, where corpses groped their way toward the sound of dripping water. No one escaped. But the corpse didn't roam aimlessly. It didn't climb walls, didn't break doors. It followed the hot water channels, as if the steam beneath Pompeii was calling back a memory it recognized. Some hid in the steam baths, thinking the heat would stop death. They didn't expect that was exactly where the corpse came first. And there, Roman history paused. Among the few survivors, there was a blind old man who made a living telling stories at the slave market. He couldn't see anything, but said he could hear them whispering to each other, not by mouth, not in sound, but by memory. They whispered in my mind, he said, as if I had once been one of them. In the silence, only the sound of steam hissing and fingernails scraping against stone tiles. The corpse from Thebes said nothing, didn't run. It just walked, as if searching for the right person. And on the 7th night, it was seen standing in the middle of Pompey Square, eyes closed, hands clasped behind its back, as if it was listening. And what it heard was not the voices of the living, but the groans of those who didn't yet know they were dead. The Romans loved public baths as much as they loved their empire. There they cleansed, They chatted. They discussed politics, wrote poetry, trimmed their mustaches, and sometimes flirted with someone else's wife. The bathhouse was the soul of the city, and in Pompeii, the largest steam bath sat at the center, like a heart radiating mist. When the city began to fall into chaos, many fled there, not because it was safe, but because they couldn't imagine a Roman world without a steam bath. People entered, locked the stone door, burned more essential oils, poured water on hot stones. The hissing sounds drowned out the screams from the streets, and they sat there drenched, waiting for death to arrive, with clean skin. Someone even joked, "If I must die, I choose to die with open pores." People laughed, but after that, no one laughed again. As soon as the mint oil was released, something outside the door smelled it, and it began to move. Then it arrived, didn't break the door, didn't smash a wall, just simply slid in along the mist. Some said it didn't open the door, but melted into the steam. Others said the door opened from the inside. A woman screamed first, but her mouth quickly filled with bloody foam. A merchant tried to defend himself with a back scrubber, and was impaled through the throat with his own coat hook. The smell of steamed flesh spread through the room. No one could tell any more which sounds were human, which were the drip of blood on hot stone floors. But not all the dead were frenzied. Some just sat still, sitting in the steam, leaning their heads against the wall, as if remembering something. One survivor recalled, before escaping, he had jumped into the cold plunge. The basin used to cool down. The corpses walked right past, didn't look, didn't sniff, but he swore. I heard them speaking to each other through the steam, not in words, but in sensation. As if my skin was remembering something. That never happened. They didn't look at me. They looked into the void, as if the steam was calling up memories we buried in our bones. And then came music. A lyre began playing somewhere in the mist. No one knew who played it. No one lived long enough to recall the melody. All that's known is, right after the music, all the corpses stood up at once and began to eat. Strangest of all, no one remembered when the feast had been laid out. No servants, no sound of trays. No one brought cakes or wine in. Yet the pastries were still warm, and the grapes plump as if freshly picked in a dream. Not each other, but a feast already prepared. Cakes, meat, fruit, red wine, running down their lips, mixing with fresh blood. An ancient note, hastily carved on a wet brick, left 4 trembling lines. They do not eat from hunger. They eat as if recalling something once sacred. The feast was not for the living, but to reenact something long forgotten. And when the next morning came, if it could still be called morning, the steam bath was silent. Only the mist lingered, and identical bite marks on every neck. The stone door was still shut, unbroken, not a single scratch. Only one blood-red line. No one knows with what it was written. They have returned, not for revenge, but to invite us to join again. When the Roman Empire sank into silence and blood, no one noticed. Something had crossed mountains, seas and snow, not by horse, not by ship, but by memory passed through a bite. It needed no language, no fire, no reason, just a body that hadn't yet forgotten what it once feared. Norway, the first winter after Pompeii disappeared. Ice blanketed the land. The Vikings weren't afraid of the cold. They were afraid of silence. Because in their culture, anything that made no sound often came from the dead. The small village by Jostedalsbreen Fjord, was once known for its thick mead and its spring ritual of hanging goat heads. That year, the goat heads were never hung, because the god post, 3 men tall, suddenly tilted 13 degrees to the south, toward Rome. No one touched it. No one dared fix it. Hrolf said, "If the gods want to look south, maybe something fun is coming." Until a boat drifted into the bay. No oars, no rowers, just 2 corpses sitting face to face, eyes open, cracked lips, as if whispering something unfinished. The village chieftain was Hrolf, a man who once split a grey bear's head with an axe, and he ordered no one to touch the boat. But the children were different. They played near the water's edge. One of them took a ring from the corpse's hand, and then the child began to speak a language no one had taught, a strange set of syllables vibrating from the throat, sounding more like blood flowing than human speech. That night, the wind changed direction. No one heard footsteps. An old blind woman living near the port had smelled something strange that afternoon. She said it was the scent of burned resin and corroded metal. No one believed her. By nightfall, she chuckled and said, "This is not the dead. This is memory, starved." Only wet footprints were found on the floor of the longhouse, where Vikings usually drank until dawn, and the wolves, creatures the Vikings never feared, howled like they were being burned alive, then fled into the forest. Hrolf did not pray, did not ask for signs, did not wait for salvation. He gathered every weapon in the village, shared them with the children, and said, "If this is the end of days, then I want it to know. We don't kneel." The fighting lasted until dawn. The corpses weren't many, but each time one was beheaded, it stood up again, not with bone, but with memory, with pain that had been forgotten. One survivor recounted, "They didn't look at me, they looked through me, as if I were a doorway to an old battlefield." Eventually, Hrolf was surrounded, but instead of fleeing, he opened the village's largest barrel of mead, poured it all over himself and laughed. "If I'm going to be eaten, at least I'll taste good." That was the last time anyone saw him. The next morning, the village was gone, except for red snow and a crude drawing on stone. On the handle of Hrolf's axe, which no one had ever touched but him, there were 4 new runes, never before seen in the old books. Roughly translated, blood remembers the way. A man standing arms wide, and behind him, a horde of memories rising from beneath the ice. A corpse stood in the snowfield, unmoving, for 3 days and nights. It didn't attack, didn't turn its head, just stared westward, where the sun no longer rose. And each time snow fell, it raised its face, as if waiting for something scarier than forgetting. Death doesn't ask your name. Death needs no explanation. But when it came to the north, it met for the first time a people who didn't beg to live. They made death remember why it once feared them. Before the Roman Empire, before the Vikings, before humans knew how to write or pray, there were them, Neanderthals. They didn't call themselves anything. They didn't need to. They just lived and crushed anything that stood between them and living. Year minus 41,000, a cave in the Altai Mountains. In the still frozen ice, modern archaeologists found 13 twisted skeletons stacked together, as if they had just been thrown into a heap. What shocked them wasn't the bite marks sinking all the way into the femurs. Though it must be said, if you bite through a femur without breaking the pelvis, then either the teeth were really good, or the thigh had a lot of meat. It was this. Each body had a small stone placed on the chest, Identical, round, smooth, as if polished by tears and fingernails. No one understands why. Some scientists say it might be a religious ritual. Some say it's geological coincidence. But one old archaeologist, retired and addicted to strong tea, muttered, "They hid their hearts in stone, not to worship, but so those things couldn't find their way in." But the legends of the nearby Munsee people recorded a phrase, very old, very strange. Those without names once cast their hearts into stone, so memory could never rise again. They had no language like ours, but they knew how to see, and they saw things even the Romans never had a name for. One day, a Neanderthal came back from a hunt with a bite mark on his neck, not from a wolf, not from a human. The bite wasn't deep, but it never dried, and after that, each night, the tribe heard breathing in the cave, not from the living, not loud, just steady, like a dream that never ends, echoing from marrow and bone. No one begged, no one ran. The Neanderthals built walls of flesh, standing to shield the children, with their backs, with their jaws, with clubs harder than elephant skulls, not to win, but to make sure memory didn't leak out through the fire. One survivor, the chieftain's daughter, threw the last torch against the cave wall, and in the final flicker of flame, they said, "I saw my father's shadow laugh, and the beast inside him laughed too." The next morning, the cave collapsed. No one survived, though one archaeological team later found two skeletons, a mother and child, buried together, but facing opposite directions. A young researcher joked, maybe they had a fight, but the guide only shook his head. No, maybe the mother didn't want to see what her child had become. All that remained were the small stones, like fossilized hearts. The memories didn't spread, didn't infect. They were buried alive, with blood, with frost, with the silence of those who never allowed themselves to become legend. Maybe the Neanderthals didn't lose because they were weak. They lost because they refused to survive by forgetting. They never named death, but they taught it fear. Rome had vanished. The Vikings froze in ice. The Neanderthals burned their memories into ash. But memory, like mold in a crypt, does not die. It seeps into places where humans bow their heads, too afraid to ask. Places where no one enters alone, like the Temple of Delphi. No one knows exactly what the oracle table at Delphi was made of. Some say stone from a sacred mountain. Some say stone from beneath the earth's heat. A retired tour guide once whispered, "I once saw the table sweating. If stone sweats, it's either alive or it knows a secret." Some sources say the stone came from Mount Parnassus. A legend says it was buried deep beneath the corpse of a talking beast, and when the sky is dark enough, the stone still whispers. Pythia, the oracle priestess, sat on that table, inhaled fumes from a geological fissure, then spoke, not in Greek, not in any language at all, just sound, which the scribes had to translate with nosebleeds, sweat, and panic. Winter of 429 before Christ. A cold night, no moon, no clouds, only the knocking outside the temple, steady, soft, and unceasing. When the guards opened the door, no one was there. Only muddy footprints going in, but none going out. That day, Pythia didn't inhale fumes. She sat at the table, and her hands bled, not from wounds, but because the stone had grown warm. When her mouth opened, sound came out without passing through her lips. No one in the temple could hear it clearly, only that many began vomiting blood from their noses. A scholar later recorded, I didn't hear anything, but I dreamed I was being eaten alive by myself. And in that dream, I sat beside myself and we both chewed. The next morning, I had no teeth. Pythia never rose from the table again. Her body was cold, but the table wasn't. Every full moon, it remained faintly warm, as if someone underneath was resting an arm, waiting their turn. A young archaeologist joked, maybe Apollo didn't finish the playlist, but his ears kept bleeding, as if still listening. The Temple of Delphi was later closed, not by decree, but because no one dared approach again, because the oracle table remained warm every crescent moon night. In 2022, a group of archaeology students secretly measured geothermal levels in the temple. The results were never published. Only one line was leaked from the report, and one student swore that the statue of Apollo behind Pythia, made of stone, had a dried red streak by the right ear. No one believed him, until someone wiped it. The stone did not react, but the temple wind stopped blowing for 5 seconds. Temperature spikes abnormally whenever someone says the word, remember. Maybe prophecy isn't meant to see the future, but to remind us of what we've tried to forget. And when that sound returns, it doesn't need to be understood. It only needs someone to listen. Silence used to be absence. Now silence has shape, has speed, has a smell. And when it covers everything, the city stops breathing. Year 1348. Florence, the richest city in Europe. Silk merchants, artisans, traders, nobles, all breathing deep, living fast, until morning mist no longer soaked their sleeves. No one noticed. Only a few night guards first said, I couldn't hear anything, not even my own breath. The next morning, 6 people were found dead, face down in pillows. No wounds, no blood, no screams, just lungs empty, as if air no longer went in, or was no longer allowed. Physicians couldn't explain it. Clergymen didn't dare name it. A boy drew on the wall a city with no nose, no mouth, only ears. Then came the church, a mass. When the scripture reached the line, and he breathed life into the nostrils of man, the entire congregation stopped breathing for 7 seconds. No one told them to. They just forgot. One survivor recalled, a vegetable boy, the only one alive after a night sleeping on the roof to avoid sweeping duties. In the morning, he found no one breathing, not even his cat. I don't remember having a nose. I only remember the feeling of someone sitting on my chest, whispering in a language that made my lungs freeze. The church was sealed. People wore scented sachets, beaked masks. One mask maker, instead of stuffing herbs, used old wool, goose feathers, and scraps of donkey skin. When asked why, he answered, nice smells save no one. Only memory keeps silence away. He was the only one who didn't sneeze during Sunday service. Though everyone agreed, he did stink a bit. They thought it was plague. It wasn't. It was the memory of suffocation. Not physical suffocation, but suffocation of the soul. The Jews were blamed. The Muslims were suspected. The poor were burned. But silence kept spreading. Some houses built double walls, triple walls, then 4. But at night, they still heard someone breathing right behind their necks. One wealthy family destroyed their bedroom, believing the walls were whispering. When they found nothing, they began biting the walls. Those who bit lost their voices by morning. It spread through alleys, through churches, through sleep, and through hugs. Eventually, Florence shut its gates, but too late. No one spoke, no one prayed, no one dared. take a deep breath. An old painter, the last to leave Florence, never opened his mouth again. He only breathed through his nose. But every time he exhaled, people heard a sound that cracked glass. Some said it was the breath of history. Others said it was the choking sob Florence had tried to hide. Either way, he kept breathing and painting. Only thing was, his paintings had no people. Only ears growing out of chairs, of walls, of his own hat brim. Because there was a rumor. If you breathe deep enough, you'll hear a sound. And that sound is the last thing you'll ever hear. Some die by sword, some by hunger. But some deaths come when the air remembers who once owed it. And when a city stops breathing, it doesn't die. It just becomes an ear. Nothing is more dangerous than a child who doesn't know who they are. Not because they're pitiful, but because they have nothing to lose. And if memory is what keeps humans from turning back into the living dead, then these children are empty. They were found in an abandoned monastery. 9 of them. Hair growing in the wrong direction. No names, no birth certificates, no language, no play. But all of them drew, not with pens, with fingernails, on the walls, on the floors, on each other's backs. One child was taken for a brain scan. Experts said, no activity in the hippocampus, the area where memories are stored. Not damaged, just never active. It hadn't forgotten. It had never remembered. When a doctor shined a light in the child's eyes, it didn't respond. But that same day, another child drew the face of a woman whom no one recognized, until one doctor broke down in tears. This is my mother. She died when I was 3, and I never showed anyone her picture. The child simply replied, I don't know who she is, but I think she once tried to remember me. But the pupils contracted when someone mentioned the name Florence. One night, a nurse wept when she saw the children sitting in a circle, drawing around her. That night, all the nurses dreamt of a giant mouth beneath the hospital floor, a mouth that didn't speak with sound, but with scent. That one's name is the smell of burning books, one recalled, still coughing from a phantom smoke. That one's name is the smell of damp stove dust. Their names are the things the world forgot to clean. No speaking, no touching, just staring, and all of them tilting their heads as if they heard something she couldn't. In the oldest child's room was a giant painting. A cartographer laughed at it, saying, "Looks like a bird's eye view of a monastery." But when he compared it to real maps, he turned pale. This room doesn't exist in any blueprint. 3 days later, they excavated. Beneath the ground was a basement, exact shape, with 9 pairs of children's shoes arranged in a circle like a silent council, drawn in nosebleed, ear blood, and an unidentified ink. The painting had no people, only a wide open mouth in the desert, and around it, children without eyes. An art appraiser said, "It's beautiful, technically brilliant, but I don't want to sleep near it." That night, the painting bled. From the mouth. Not much, just a few drops. But they didn't drip downward, they dripped up. The children's files disappeared 3 weeks later. The painting was sealed, but rumor has it, one child was adopted by a couple who couldn't conceive. And once, he brought a drawing over to the neighbor's house, showing a city, no people, no things, only ears growing from the walls. When asked who taught him to draw Florence, the boy looked up and calmly said, "I saw it in a dream. A wall told me." The neighbor said, "He's a sweet kid, doesn't cry, doesn't laugh, but every Sunday morning He stands facing the wall, like he's waiting for someone to whisper on the back of his neck. People often say, "Don't let memories fall into the wrong hands." But what about a mind with no memory to hold on to? Then what? These children don't carry anyone's past, but they carry something even more frightening. A painting made of things that never happened. There was a survivor, no name, no face, no archived records, only a sense of smell so strong it could read history. That person walked through Florence and said, "Here, someone once held breath in the palm of their hand." Over there, a child named their mother after the scent of old candle wax. And right on this very stone, a wall once swallowed a man who lied. He didn't write anything down, just walked and sniffed. Sniffed as if the world were an unopened letter. Each scent, a letter. Each corpse, a stanza that needed no rhyme. Each memory, a kind of gas that forgot how to rise. Someone asked him, "So what are you looking for?" He smiled and pointed to his nose. "I'm looking for what still reeks, because only what hasn't rotted yet is still terrifying." One night, he entered a nameless cave. No exit, no light. But he didn't turn on a lamp, just stood there, inhaled. And when he exhaled, the walls began to crack. No explosion, no tremor, just cracking in sync with the heartbeat. And inside there was nothing, only an empty space, smelling like a memory not yet born. That survivor disappeared. No one ever found him. Only a few rough sketches scattered across the places he had passed. A hollow, laughing mouth, an ear without a rim, a nose sniffing, itself. And on a faintly cracked clay wall, there was one sentence: "If you've made it this far, then you've carried something from them." Not words, not images, not memories, but the ability to remember what you've never lived. Because the ending only comes to those who have no one left to tell the story to. But you're still here, and you've heard. So this is not the end. Mark Antony, lover of Cleopatra, rival for an empire. When the flames devoured the city, when the enemy's hooves echoed fiercely through the night, a man lay bleeding inside an unfinished tomb. That was Mark Antony, the great general, once a man who shook the world, now had only one thing left to do: raise a final cup of wine and bid farewell to power, to love, and to the life he once held. In the year 30 before Christ, Alexandria, the city of light and power, suddenly turned into a scene of mourning. Smoke from half-burned scrolls in the great library curled up into a sky-stained red. The people pushed and trampled one another as they fled, the cries of children lost amid the statues of gods being toppled and smashed upon cold stone. Domes collapsed, pillars broke in half. Alexandria wasn't just burning, it was collapsing as a symbol betrayed by the very era that once birthed it. Fire rose from the ancient houses, the smell of ash mixed with the pounding of hooves echoing down every palm-lined street. This city, once the center of knowledge, beauty, and power, now drowned in chaos, a prelude to the end of an age. Amid the rubble of an unfinished tomb, a man lay curled, exhausted and bleeding. Mark Antony, the general who once made empires tremble. In the flickering glow of one last sunset, he thought of victories in Syria, of drunken nights with his men in Gaul's camps, of that fateful handshake with Julius Caesar, and Cleopatra's first smile by the Nile. He also remembered the mistakes, the Battle of Actium, failed political games, and that moment when he realized he no longer belonged to either world. It all came back in an instant, like a grand tragedy where the final act arrived too soon and the lead actor no longer had the right to change the script. The general who once shook empires now lay broken. His body, once mighty on the battlefield, was badly wounded and growing weaker by the hour. Though his flesh was nearing its final breath, his mind echoed with glory, of battles, of passions wild and mad. He raised his final cup of wine, looked at his lover Cleopatra, and in that moment, an ancient tragedy became an immortal legend. In the distance, Roman helmets began to shimmer in the blood-red dusk. Boots struck stone in rhythm, cold, steady, and merciless. Inside the tomb, a trembling cup touched his lips. Outside, history marched forward, cold, with no explanation needed. You could say this wasn't just the story of a man's death. It was a ballad of power, love, and collapse. From the wild beginnings beside Julius Caesar, to the hypnotic love with Cleopatra, from glorious victories in Gaul, to the bloody ruin at Actium. We'll trace each step of triumph and each rung of downfall that led Mark Antony to this fateful end. A journey from dazzling light to eternal silence. And now, I invite you to step into the world of Mark Antony, a man who lived larger than history, and died with a story that has never grown old. Mark Antony was born on January 14th, in the year 83 before Christ, right in the heart of the Roman Republic, ablaze with war and the thirst for power. It was an era where every street corner in Rome echoed with the shouts of political debates, the clinking of cutlery at aristocratic banquets, and the rhythmic clatter of horse hooves across dusty forums. The Senate was losing its grip. Generals like Sulla and Pompey were rising as self-proclaimed overlords. And down in the streets, the young nobles partied like the world was ending tomorrow. And Mark Antony, a young man of noble blood but foggy future, was just one small part of that chaotic dance. His lineage, wealthy but hardly respected. His father was a general known for losing. His mother was related to Julius Caesar, though at the time, Caesar was just a curly-haired 17-year-old, and no one could have guessed he'd one day rip the Republic apart with his own hands. And Antony, he was handsome, full of life, and completely adrift. They said he was tall, sun-kissed, with curls like Apollo, but his gaze belonged to Dionysus, distracted, passionate, always chasing the next pleasure. Antony had a silver tongue, a gift for riding horses, and an odd magnetism that made both men and women remember him. But that same charm, without purpose, became the wind that pushed his life's sail into whirlpools of indulgence and waste. At just over 15, Antony met Curio, a seasoned partygoer, older, slick, and exceptionally skilled at spending other people's money. Under Curio's wing, Antony quickly became the poster child of a Roman rich kid. Fine wine, beautiful women, gambling, and blackout nights in the red light corners of Subura, the infamous slum of Rome. Before turning 20, Antony was already over 250 talents in debt, nearly $5 million today, all spent chasing aimless nights of pleasure. This young man, like a ship without a rudder, decided to study abroad in Greece to explore philosophy. Athens at the time was the heart of knowledge and art, where long-bearded philosophers sighed into their wine, and Greek tragedies played nightly under flickering torchlight. Antony rented a small house near the Agora, attended lectures at Plato's Academy, but his heart drifted to the songs of street musicians. Truthfully, he was still partying, just in a prettier, older setting with more grapes. He adored Stoic philosophers, but couldn't recall a single line of Epictetus. He sat in lecture halls, but his eyes were always on the stage, where silk dancers spun like Dionysus himself reborn. Yet in this decadence, a strange seed took root, a love for Greek culture, a love that would haunt him until his very last breath. In Greece, he became a skilled horseman, a decent swordsman, and continued living as if tomorrow didn't exist, until tomorrow knocked. A Roman general named Aulus Gabinius, preparing a military campaign in Syria, saw untapped potential in the reckless young man. Perhaps he'd heard of Antony through an impromptu horse match, or through a fellow noble. Gabinius didn't just see physical strength. He saw unshaped chaos, the kind a battlefield could mold into command. And so, in the year 57 before Christ, Mark Antony donned armor for the first time, gripped a sword, and left behind the world of wine and debt. He thought he'd drink more wine in some far-off land. Instead, Antony found something he never expected, a calling to be a warrior. That first fire of battle didn't destroy him. It brought him back to life. The shouting, the blood, the dust of war horses, everything others feared, made Antony's heart pound like the ancient drumbeat from Mars's own forge. And thus, Mark Antony, once a decadent cavalryman, began his journey to becoming one of the great power symbols of history. When Mark Antony turned 20, he was not a warrior, not a successful nobleman, not a Greek scholar, as he had told his mother when he left Rome. He was a runaway from history. With a calling card written in debt and bad reputation, Antony wandered between Athens and small coastal towns, leaving behind unpaid nights of drinking and oaths to turn his life around that never saw daylight. One evening in 58 before Christ, he was thrown out of an inn for not having enough rent money, forced to sleep on the stone steps outside the agora. That night, under the Greek moonlight, he chuckled and murmured lines of Sappho's poetry, while stray dogs growled and fought over a stale piece of bread. It wasn't romantic. It was a Roman youth gone astray, trying to fake the poetry of life without knowing the right notes. But life has its moments, tiny ones, where if you stand in the right place at the right time and lift your head at the right angle, history shifts. For Mark Antony, that moment came on a summer afternoon in the year 57 before Christ. In the barracks courtyard outside Thebes, he was summoned to meet Aulus Gabinius, a Roman general short on men to lead troops into Syria and Egypt. No one knows why Gabinius chose Antony. Maybe it was a recommendation from noble friends. Or maybe he liked the reckless, half-drunk young man who could still ride a horse without falling. On his first battle ride, Antony galloped as if performing at the theatre of Dionysus, loud, theatrical, but not the least bit afraid. And strangely, in the shouting, in the blood of Eastern rebels, Antony suddenly tasted something unfamiliar, meaning. In that moment, when his first sword met an enemy's throat, when hot blood sprayed and horses shrieked through red dust, Antony didn't vomit. He didn't shake. On the contrary, he felt an odd calm, as if, for the first time, he knew who he was. No more gambling, no more debt, only the clash of steel and life, something he could control, not glory, not fame, but a reason to exist. He began to obey, to focus, and to kill the enemy without hesitation. Under the searing sun of the Syrian desert, the former hedonist was slowly transforming. The journey to Egypt with Gabinius didn't just take him to the battlefield. It brought him a first glimpse, a fleeting one, of destiny. There, amid tense negotiations with the rebels opposing Ptolemy XII, Antony was tasked with escorting the royal family. As he rode through the palace corridors, a beam of sunlight from a window caught the face of a young girl reading a papyrus scroll. Her eyes glowed with the color of the Nile after rain, quiet but deep. That moment passed like a blink from a myth, and one of the children he saw that day, sitting by the window, eyes like the Nile's midnight, was Cleopatra. She was only 14. Antony, nearly 30. There was nothing between them. No exchanged glances, no sign from the heavens, only, as fate often does, a silent punctuation mark as they passed each other. And history took note. After the campaign, Antony returned to Rome. This time, not as a runaway debtor, but as a skilled cavalryman, a man who could lead, who could win, and knew how to raise a cup without letting go of the sword at his side. Rome welcomed him, but also cast him into a new storm, politics. At the welcome feast, Antony toasted with generals, but his eyes scanned those at the end of the table, where whispers decided who would survive the next Senate session. That night, in his dream, he saw himself walking between two roads. One led to the battlefield, the other into a palace where Caesar's face was still a blur. Antony, once a drunken youth, was entering the labyrinth of Roman power, a place filled with men like Pompey, like Crassus, and a name growing larger every day, Julius Caesar. Mark Antony had stepped out of the shadows of youth, but the light ahead was not salvation. It was fire. It was power. It was roads paved with corpses and applause made of lies. The playboy of yesterday had become someone history could not ignore. And from here on, every choice he made would lead toward the abyss. In the year 49 before Christ, a small river, the Rubicon, sliced through Italy like an old wound that never quite healed. And on its banks, Roman history was torn in two. The night before crossing the Rubicon, Julius Caesar sat inside his tent. The night wind blew cold, and the river lapped against the shore like the faint drumbeat of the god of war. On the table, maps were laid out, and the Rubicon drawn as a streak of red ink, small but deep. Caesar stared at that boundary, his hand trembling slightly as he set the pen down. No one spoke, but everyone knew. A single step, and there would be no return. Torchlight flickered across his face. He was no longer just a general, but the man about to become the greatest traitor in the history of the Republic. Beside him stood Mark Antony, silent, hand on his sword hilt. He said nothing. He didn't need to. They both knew. Once they crossed, they could never go back. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. Caesar crossed the river. Antony followed. And so began a civil war. No more neutrality, no more law. Only two paths remained. Follow Caesar or be crushed. In the military campaigns that followed, Caesar made Antony his second in command. From Italy to Hispania, Antony wasn't just Caesar's right hand. He was the one who understood both the blood and the dreams of a dictator coming into being. Antony ate in trenches with the soldiers, slept on the ground, rode by day, drank by night. One rainy night in Gaul, a young soldier asked him, "General, if we win, what do we get?" Antony smiled, a tired smile, and said, "A dry bed and another day to fight." Lines like that made him a legend in the ranks, not for victories, but for endurance and the ability to laugh in the face of tragedy. He was a general who didn't act like a general, and for that, they loved him more. To the soldiers, he was one of us. To the Senate, he was a thorn, the shadow of Caesar, a threat that couldn't be eliminated. While Caesar pursued Pompey, Antony stayed behind to govern Rome. And for the first time, we saw Mark Antony fail, not on the battlefield, but in the seat of power. He was too lenient, too loud, too drunk. The people rioted. The Senate grew furious. Plutarch wrote, "He ruled Rome not as a consul, but as a tavern keeper." Caesar returned, not with laurels, but with wrath. He entered Rome amid public squabbles, soaring grain prices, and hoarders stockpiling goods. A riot had broken out in the Capitoline market when one of Antony's soldiers accidentally killed a beggar. The city boiled like a pressure cooker, waiting for the final whistle. Caesar nearly punished Antony, but in the end, forgave him. And in that moment, the brotherhood between them split like a broken coin. One half was loyalty, the other a jealousy still unspoken, for Caesar did not return with just victory. He returned with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, the woman Antony had once glimpsed long ago. Now she stepped down from a golden carriage, amid the sound of Egyptian horns, with eyes lined in black like a living statue, and a gaze that could bring any general to his knees. Antony stood at a distance, feeling like a young soldier on the Nile's edge, small, lost and meaningless. She had returned, more alluring, more intelligent, and now the mother of Caesar's son. Antony, once an ally, now had to kneel before a queen he might once have protected. It wasn't just humiliation, it was the thundercloud forming on the horizon. Then came the Ides of March, 44 before Christ. Caesar was stabbed 23 times, collapsing beneath the statue of Pompey. Antony, arriving too late, saw only blood soaking the Senate stone steps. What was left behind was not just a corpse, but an heir not named. And then, as fate would have it, Antony opened the will. No mention of him, no share of power, only a pale, unfamiliar name, Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew. At that moment, Antony must have heard the Rubicon roaring again in his mind, not because he was about to cross it, but because this time, history was crossing over him. In the year 41 before Christ, Mark Antony, the man who once crossed the Rubicon with Caesar, who nearly became the heir to an empire, was now waiting for a date. But this was no ordinary date, and the woman he was waiting for was no dull Roman widow. Her name was Cleopatra, Queen of the Nile, the one who made Caesar kneel, the woman who made all of Alexandria breathe to the rhythm of her own heartbeat. A mythical entrance Tarsus, a sweltering late summer afternoon, 41 before Christ. The air was thick with incense smoke, and the murmurs of locals gathered along the riverbanks. They had heard a goddess was coming, not metaphorically. Cleopatra did not arrive quietly. She did not walk. She descended upon Tarsus like a deity stepping out of an epic. She didn't arrive in silence. She didn't walk. She landed in Tarsus like a goddess from legend. Aboard a ship with silver oars, she sat beneath an arch of roses, wearing purple silk, a golden crown atop her head. 2 rows of attendants perfumed the air with Greek oils, while lyre players strummed songs of Aphrodite's tales. Antony, experienced battle-worn, familiar with heads rolling in mud, looked at the scene as if gazing into his own youth, into memory, into a story left unfinished. When she descended the steps of her ship, Cleopatra didn't ask what he wanted. She commanded the air around them to soften. No need for love, only victory, a love beyond politics. At first, their relationship was an agreement. She needed Rome. He needed an eastern base. She needed backing to keep her throne. He needed a wealthy ally with ships. But Alexandria wasn't Rome, and Cleopatra wasn't any woman from the Forum. That winter, between potent wine and moonlit hunts, Antony and Cleopatra became two giant children, playing in their own kingdom. They founded the inimitable Livers Club, where the only rule was to drink until you forgot your name. They dressed in disguises and wandered the streets at night, tossing coins to singers, laughing in crowds like two souls lost from their thrones. But after the drinking came moments of stillness. One night, Antony stood on the balcony of Alexandria's palace, wine in hand, eyes fixed on the misty Nile. He told Cleopatra, "I once thought the wind on Palatine Hill was the coldest in the world, but here, it blows through your bones and reminds you of everything that was never truly yours." Cleopatra didn't reply. She only hummed an old tune from Thebes, as if to say, memory is the one thing that cannot be conquered. Antony, who once ruled half the world, now listened as Cleopatra recited poetry. He asked about the scent of wind in Thebes. She told him of the time she nearly died from a crocodile in the delta. They began to love each other, not because they needed to, but because they couldn't not. Nights spent together. There was a night they sat in a granite room, surrounded by oil lamps reflecting tired eyes. Cleopatra told the myth of Isis and Osiris, of how love could resurrect life. Antony, sitting across from her, told of the night Caesar was assassinated, of how an empire could crumble with just 23 blades. In that moment, they were no longer king or queen, just two souls wrestling with memory and foreboding. But Rome waits for no one. While they bathed in silk and wine, Octavian in Rome did not sleep. The pale nephew of Caesar was conquering faction after faction, and Antony's grip on Western Europe faded. The Romans began whispering, "Where is General Antony now?" He's stationed in Egypt's bedroom. Even in a play performed in Pompeii, Cleopatra was mocked as the woman who controlled the Roman puppet with her bed. By the year 37 before Christ, they had to wake up. Antony met with Octavian. A new agreement was made. Antony would supply 120 warships. In return, Octavian promised 4 legions. He waited and waited, only to realize Octavian had deceived him. A love woven into strategy. After the betrayal, Antony never returned to Rome. He stayed in Egypt for good, and he began blocking letters from Rome. A Roman envoy came to see him. Antony refused to receive him. As the envoy left, Egyptians whispered, "Is he one of us now?" Day by day, Antony sank deeper, not just into love, but into a choice with no turning back. He married Cleopatra in Eastern ritual, granted her children titles, and called Caesarion King of Kings. He bet everything on an Eastern hand. And Cleopatra, by now, was not just a lover. She was a comrade in destiny, a queen of half the dream. They believed they were rewriting a new Iliad, but Rome didn't write poetry. It wrote blood into maps. The year is 43 before Christ. Rome is no longer a city of principles. It's a shipwreck torn apart by political storms, with 3 men rowing in 3 different directions. Mark Antony, the man who once raised Caesar's bloodied cloak in the Forum, now had to make peace with the man he hated most, Octavian. Together, with the third wheel, Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a 10-year pact, a carving of the empire as if Rome were nothing more than a pizza of power. But that pact wasn't born in celebration. They met on a barren island off Brundisium. No guards, no standards, just 3 men sitting across from each other on a cold, damp slab of stone. No one looked the others in the eye. When Lepidus signed, his hand shook so much the ink stained his tunic. Octavian smiled, the kind of smile that learns how to wait. Antony said nothing the whole time, and as he stood up, he whispered, "The 3 of us will not die on the same day." A pact of 3 ghosts, Antony took the east. Octavian held the west. Lepidus, the weakest, was tossed into Africa like a burnt crust. But none of them wanted peace. Everyone knew this handshake was just a blade sheathed for now. All it needed was a reason, an opening. Cassius and Brutus, the ghosts of assassination in the east, the 2 masterminds of Caesar's murder, Cassius and Marcus Brutus, were gathering armies in Asia and Macedonia. The Senate did nothing, divided, terrorized by death lists. Every day brought news of a noble's property or head being taken. Some even wrote their own names on their doors and hanged themselves in their ancestral homes just to avoid waiting for soldiers. The next day, their sons joined Antony's army, not for ideals, but because in his camp, death was at least predictable. The triumvirs moved faster. They grabbed gold, conscripted men, and marched east. The Battle of Philippi, where history breaks. By the end of 42 before Christ, 2 armies, Antony and Octavian versus Cassius and Brutus, clashed at Philippi in northern Greece. 2 battles, 2 destinies. Cassius, believing his camp had fallen, ordered his slave to kill him. His tent still smelled of wine and soldiers' sweat. They say Cassius never saw his troops pushing back the enemy on the other flank. He died in confusion, lying on a deerskin that hadn't even been spread out properly. A few days later, Brutus was utterly defeated and took his own life too. It said he drew his sword, turned his back to the sunset, and ran onto the blade. No scream, just a soft breeze, enough to lift the dust-stained hem of his cloak. An era had ended. The killers of Caesar, now nothing but dust in forgotten indictments. Antony, the lonely victor Octavian, returned to Rome, soaked in glory, dressed in white, weeping for the people. Antony returned to the east and fell into Cleopatra's arms, as if victory meant nothing without her. Cleopatra welcomed him, not as a general, but as a pharaoh returning from the dark. She placed a crown on his head. Romans whispered, Antony was disappearing into silk and incense. But in Rome, the men without armor had begun to count his every mistake. Among them, Octavian, and he was very, very good at counting. Cleopatra was not born to love. She was born to survive. In the year 41 before Christ, when Antony arrived in Tarsus to summon her, Cleopatra did not bring an army. She arrived on a silver ship inlaid with gems, with sails scented in resin, oars shimmering like the scales of a mythical fish. Each stroke of the oar beat like the rhythm of a divine performance, and she herself was the goddess Aphrodite incarnate. The entire city of Tarsus fell silent for a moment longer than any diplomatic ceremony ever seen. She came with a silver ship, robes like Aphrodite, and the sound of Greek lyres drifting across the river Cydnus. Antony, once a lover of Greek philosophy, didn't realize he was witnessing a dream made flesh, a union, or a beginning. At first, it was all politics. Cleopatra needed to secure the Ptolemaic throne. Beneath that mythic cloak, she observed everything. Antony's eyes, the posture of his officers, even the stance of the Roman guards. She knew this wasn't just a meeting. It was a silent war, where glances and gestures were the real weapons. Antony needed stability in Egypt to focus on campaigns in the east. They were playing chess. But soon, another game began. The game of feeling. Alexandria. The winter of those who couldn't part. That winter felt like a world outside the flow of time. Alexandria was soaked in incense, red wine, and soft music echoing through stone-paved streets. No one spoke of Rome. No one counted days. They lived like souls cursed for loving too deeply, or for being too foolish. It was a time without politics, without duty, only bodies, laughter, and fleeting moments vanishing like incense smoke during a sacred procession. The winter of 41. Before Christ, Antony stayed in Alexandria. By day, they hunted. By night, they wandered in disguise. They founded a drinking club, the inimitable Livers, known for crashing private homes with surprise feasts, then apologizing by leaving bags of gold behind. Cleopatra made Antony forget he was Roman, and Antony made her believe that this time she could live as a woman, not a symbol. The cost of love. But Rome is not a place you can forget. In 40 before Christ, Octavian married Antony's sister, Octavia, and Antony had to return, if only to preserve temporary peace. Cleopatra gave birth. Antony was absent. Alexandria grew cold, and she began to understand. To love a Roman was like holding fire in your hands. No matter how tightly you grip it, it will leave a burn. When love becomes empire. In 37, before Christ, Antony returned, this time with his sword pointed at Parthia and his heart set on Egypt. He declared Caesarion the true heir of Caesar, that young boy who had never fought, never spoken, now bore on his brow the heavy shadow of a dead empire. In Caesarion's eyes, there was something like the crack in Rome itself, fragile, fated, and utterly alone. He divided the eastern territories between Cleopatra and her children. Rome called him a traitor, but in Alexandria, the two ascended like Pharaoh and the goddess Isis. Nothing makes a Roman more immortal than a failed war. In the year 36 before Christ, Mark Antony departed, carrying an unfinished dream, the dream Julius Caesar died before realizing, to invade Parthia, to avenge the humiliation of Crassus at Carrhae, to reclaim Rome's lost honor. But beneath the grand excuse, this was also a political wager. Antony needed a victory to redeem himself after that winter of love-struck blindness in Alexandria. He needed blood to mask the scent of Cleopatra's perfume in Roman eyes. The bloody road to the east. As the Roman army advanced deep into Parthia, there was one thing no one dared say. No one knew the way back. As they marched, sinking into the mud and snow of the Armenian highlands, the footprints behind them were slowly erased by wind, just like the confidence once shining in their eyes. The first soldier didn't die from an arrow, but from cold, the second from thirst, the third from despair. When the army finally retreated, they looked like a band of ghosts, leaning on broken spears, carrying their friends' corpses, cloaks soaked in mud like dried blood. A cavalryman who once triumphed in Syria now slumped on a wooden cart, breathing in groans. Antony didn't look at anyone, but he heard it all, the cracking of bones, the howling wind, and the voice in his chest whispering, "What am I doing here?" He had brought 100,000 soldiers, a massive force that crossed Armenia and marched deep into Parthian territory. But Parthia was not Gaul. There were no fortresses to besiege, no battle lines to break, only scorched plains and invisible horsemen, appearing like wind vanishing like dust. Lured deeper, the Roman army fell into a trap. Weather brutal, supplies severed, soldiers exhausted, and the enemy never showed their face. When the blade of shame speaks louder than the enemy, and then someone mentioned Crassus, the man who led the army to Carrhae in 53 before Christ and lost his head chasing Parthian gold. Crassus, one of the original triumvirs, had died in the very lands Antony now trampled. History returned like a shadow, asking, "You think you're different?" Antony had never fought without winning, but this time there was no battle to lose, only attrition, retreat, and invisible death. More than 30,000 soldiers perished. Not from tactics, but from frost, hunger, and delusion. Antony, the brilliant general, the legendary cavalryman, now retreated through the eastern winter like a defeated man no one had bothered to defeat. The man who almost stabbed himself. Antony had always been a man of action. But now he sat still, among the remnants of his army, like a statue with no name. The Syrian winter night was so cold even the ashes froze. By flickering firelight, he saw two faces appear, the bloodied faces of loyal soldiers, and Cleopatra's smile, the two pillars of his life. One was death, one was love, and between them, a chasm he no longer knew how to cross. When he returned to Syria, he camped in silence, his beard long, clothes torn, eyes sunken with disgrace. According to Plutarch, he once held a blade in his hand, ready to end it, like an old Roman general. But then, Cleopatra came. She embraced him in the army camp, not with glory, but with forgiveness. "You are not dead," she said, "because you have not finished your fate." Antony lowered the sword and wept like a man, not because he lost, but because he realized everything he had built was still not enough to hold on to an empire slipping through his fingers. An empire collapsing from within. But what he didn't know was that the moment he bowed his head, Octavian had raised his. In Rome, new statues began to rise, not of Antony, but of a young Caesar, reborn in the image of his cold-blooded nephew. The defeat in Parthia wasn't just the end of a campaign, it was the death knell of a reign that never truly began. By the time he returned to Egypt, the winds had shifted in Rome. Octavian didn't need to fight, only to retell, to say that Mark Antony was no longer a general, but a drunken puppet in Cleopatra's bed, no longer Roman, but a slave of the East. The Parthian campaign, instead of restoring glory, became the banner for Octavian to convince the Senate, we must protect Rome from one of our own. And so, while Antony quietly tried to stitch his honor back together, Octavian began sewing the robes of a future emperor. Nothing makes a Roman more immortal than a failed war. In the year 36 before Christ, Mark Antony departed, carrying an unfinished dream, the dream Julius Caesar died before realizing, to invade Parthia, to avenge the humiliation of Crassus at Carrhae, to reclaim Rome's lost honor. But beneath the grand excuse, this was also a political wager. Antony needed a victory to redeem himself after that winter of love-struck blindness in Alexandria. He needed blood to mask the scent of Cleopatra's perfume in Roman eyes. The bloody road to the east. As the Roman army advanced deep into Parthia, there was one thing no one dared say. No one knew the way back. As they marched, sinking into the mud and snow of the Armenian highlands, the footprints behind them were slowly erased by wind, just like the confidence once shining in their eyes. The first soldier didn't die from an arrow, but from cold. the second from thirst, the third from despair. When the army finally retreated, they looked like a band of ghosts, leaning on broken spears, carrying their friends' corpses, cloaks soaked in mud like dried blood. A cavalryman who once triumphed in Syria now slumped on a wooden cart, breathing in groans. Antony didn't look at anyone, but he heard it all. The cracking of bones, the howling wind, and the voice in his chest whispering, "What am I doing here?" He had brought 100,000 soldiers, a massive force that crossed Armenia and marched deep into Parthian territory. But Parthia was not Gaul. There were no fortresses to besiege, no battle lines to break. Only scorched plains and invisible horsemen, appearing like wind, vanishing like dust. Lured deeper, the Roman army fell into a trap. Weather brutal, supplies severed, soldiers exhausted, and the enemy never showed their face. When the blade of shame speaks louder than the enemy, and then someone mentioned Crassus, the man who led the army to Cari in 53 before Christ, and lost his head chasing Parthian gold. Crassus, one of the original triumvirs, had died in the very lands Antony now trampled. History returned like a shadow, asking, "You think you're different?" Antony had never fought without winning. But this time, there was no battle to lose. Only attrition, retreat, and invisible death. More than 30,000 soldiers perished, not from tactics, but from frost, hunger, and delusion. Antony, the brilliant general, the legendary cavalryman, now retreated through the eastern winter like a defeated man no one had bothered to defeat. The man who almost stabbed himself, Antony had always been a man of action. But now he sat still, among the remnants of his army, like a statue with no name. The Syrian winter night was so cold even the ashes froze. By flickering firelight, he saw two faces appear, the bloodied faces of loyal soldiers and Cleopatra's smile, the two pillars of his life. One was death, one was love, and between them, a chasm he no longer knew how to cross. When he returned to Syria, he camped in silence, his beard long, clothes torn, eyes sunken with disgrace. According to Plutarch, he once held a blade in his hand, ready to end it, like an old Roman general. But then, Cleopatra came. She embraced him in the army camp, not with glory, but with forgiveness. "You are not dead," she said, "because you have not finished your fate." Antony lowered the sword and wept like a man, not because he lost, but because he realized everything he had built was still not enough to hold on to an empire slipping through his fingers. The defeat in Parthia wasn't just the end of a campaign. It was the death knell of a reign that never truly began. By the time he returned to Egypt, the winds had shifted in Rome. Octavian didn't need to fight, only to retell. To say that Mark Antony was no longer a general, but a drunken puppet in Cleopatra's bed. No longer Roman, but a slave of the East. The Parthian campaign, instead of restoring glory, became the banner for Octavian to convince the Senate, we must protect Rome from one of our own. And so, while Antony quietly tried to stitch his honor back together, Octavian began sewing the robes of a future emperor. Not every empire dies by sword and steel. On the outside, the sea was still as glass, the sky as blue as if it were cheering. But inside, Actium wasn't a battle. It was a 6-month martyrdom, where every glance knew the ending, but no one dared to speak it. Some empires die because of one last hope. In 31 before Christ, Mark Antony set sail. He brought with him 400 warships, a queen, and a plan no one understood, perhaps not even himself. At the other end of the Mediterranean, Octavian, now in control of nearly all the West, was moving not only soldiers, but poets, orators, and painters. Each letter from Rome was a dagger in Antony's reputation. He was painted as a man who had lost his reason and lost Rome to a woman. He was running a war that was no longer military. It was a war of image, of words, and of fear. To Rome, Antony was no longer a general, but a lovesick fool, a puppet, an Eastern king wearing Roman armor. A fleet in a noose Antony's ships anchored in the Gulf of Actium, a small bay in northwestern Greece, a windless place, quiet and easy to blockade. He chose to wait, perhaps believing reinforcements would come from Egypt, perhaps because he wasn't ready to die. But Octavian, with his general Agrippa, didn't wait. Their ships crept forward. The noose tightened, slowly, like a butcher choosing his final stroke. Inside the bay, Antony's men were starving, thirsty, and divided. Many ships were short of oars. Drinking water was thinned with rain. Old flags hung so tattered that no one knew which side they were on. And on deck, guards stood not against the enemy, but against each other. Some officers demanded an attack, others begged for retreat, and Antony, sitting at his maps, just stared out to sea. What was he waiting for? The torn sails of fate, September 2nd, 31 before Christ. The fog lifted, the horn sounded. The fate of Antony now hung in the sails. Cleopatra's ship stood in the center of the fleet, like a goddess in a sea of men. She wore a crown and golden armor. But when Agrippa's forces pushed in, instead of leading a counterattack, Cleopatra turned her ship and fled. Perhaps it was a tactic. Perhaps it was survival instinct. Antony saw it. From the deck, he watched Cleopatra, not as the Queen of Egypt, but as the retreating silhouette of fate, cutting through the waves in the blood-red dusk, drifting eastward, and he chose to follow, leaving behind the fleet, the dream, and those who still believed in him. The endgame at sea and beneath honor. When Antony and Cleopatra fled Actium, it wasn't a maneuver. It was the beginning of the end. The remaining Roman forces surrendered quickly. Some ships set themselves on fire. Others turned their prows and raised white flags. In Rome, Octavian needed no more battles. He only had to bring back one story. Antony abandoned the war for a woman and left Rome to lose, and that story defeated every sword. The sea was still, but the soul was not. Antony never looked back. From Actium to Alexandria, he said little. He simply stared at the sea, and every wave crashing against the bow whispered that he had lost everything, not because he was weak, not because he was evil, but because he was the last man trying to hold together an empire that no longer wanted to exist. A cup of wine, and an empire collapses in silence. August, 30 before Christ. Alexandria was no longer a city. It was a crack spreading along the Mediterranean coast. The library lay silent, as if even the books had stopped breathing. The statue of Isis was dragged down in front of the fish market. Her head fell onto the steps like an omen. People burned papers, hid their gold, and whispered incantations in 3 languages. A city was dying, step by step, with every brick crushed beneath fleeing feet. Alexandria was stifling and restless like a fever that wouldn't break. People hid beneath awnings, avoiding the sun and the truth. In the distance, the horizon shimmered silver. It wasn't the sea. It was the armor of Octavian's soldiers. a machine without pause, drawing closer by the meter. Inside, Mark Antony walked slowly through marble corridors. Memories surged, like fire racing through the gut. He remembered Gaul, remembered Rubicon, remembered Julius laughing on horseback, remembered Cleopatra tilting her head the first time in Alexandria's incense smoke. Everything, like a golden dream overturned at midnight. His military boots tapped softly, not like a general's, but like a man lost inside the museum of his own past. He had once conquered Gaul, once sat beside Julius Caesar, once heard thousands chant his name beneath fluttering banners. Now the only sound was rusted metal, broken swords, and the footsteps of defeat. The final line news arrived. Cleopatra was dead. A soldier, trembling, reported that the Queen of Egypt had taken poison. Her death, quick, clean, without a trace. Antony didn't ask again. He only nodded and walked into the final room. He loved Cleopatra, the way a soldier loves a standard, because it was the only thing that still gave reason to fight. Without her, there was nothing left to hold. The blade and the last blessing. Antony did not choose the heart. He chose the belly, the place that had carried victories, feasts, and every swallowed fury. He collapsed onto the floor, not heroically, like in Shakespeare, but quietly, trembling, blood pooling across cold stone. One servant fled in terror, another wept, but no one stopped him. Cleopatra was not dead. The rumor was a ruse, the final move of Egypt's wisest woman. When she learned Antony was dying, she ordered him brought to the unfinished tomb. They couldn't meet in court, so they met in the place built for death. Antony was dragged in, blood seeping into cloth. Cleopatra knelt. She didn't cry. She only looked at him, as if trying to carve that face into her bones. Antony, with what strength remained, said, "Bring the wine." A soldier placed the cup in his hand. He lifted it, shaking, and looked at her one last time. "We do not die from failure," he whispered, "but because we once believed we could win through love." Antony died in Cleopatra's arms, not just a general breathing his last, but an era closing its own hand. From this day, no one stood between republic and empire. No one between Caesar and Augustus. Only one road remained, and it was paved with the shadow of Rome's throne. Inside the cold tomb, no drums, no titles, only one broken breath and a chapter sealed in blood. Outside, Egyptian sunlight still poured through the arched window. A drop of red wine lingered in the cup, glinting like blood. A sparrow landed on the rail, then flew away. No trumpets, no legions. No one recorded his final words. But there, among stone, dust, and love long gone, an empire was buried. August 30 before Christ. Cleopatra VII, the last woman of the Ptolemaic line, the last to dare challenge Rome with her gaze, chose death, not by the hand of her enemy, but by her own. People say she used the venom of an asp, but it could have been a blade, poison, or simply despair. Alexandria was silent, as if holding its breath. The whole world looked east and saw no one. No more pharaoh, no more incense smoke, only dust and Roman banners raised over the harbour. Octavian entered the city like a ghost without a sword. No one resisted, because the heart of that city had already died. A Game of Thrones Caesarion, the only son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, was led away like a shadow, executed, so no one would doubt who the true heir was. Octavian, then 33 years old, officially became Augustus in 27 before Christ. and history changed its name. The Roman Republic was dead, and an empire from the ashes was born. What remains? Mark Antony has no tomb, no state funeral, no statue in the Roman Forum, but he has something even Augustus, for all his greatness, could never possess: a story, a tragedy, a love that could stop an empire's heart. People remember him for his failure, for wagering an entire career for a woman's gaze, but for that very reason, he is remembered more than all the emperors who lined up after. Shakespeare remembers him, Hollywood remembers him, and even the sleepless in the night remember him. An ending without a period. If history is a painting, then Mark Antony is the crimson brushstroke slashing across every predictable line. He was not perfect, not careful, not calculating, but he loved to the point of foolishness, and fought until there was no reason left but honor. And for that, he became legend, not because of victory, but because his defeat was as beautiful as an unfinished symphony. How the Roman Colosseum was built. Why would humans build a place to kill each other, like a festival? The year was 64 Common Era. Rome was burning. Not the kind of fire across the street, but one that spread from block to block, destroying 10 out of the city's 14 administrative districts. They say the fire started on the night of July 18th, 64 Common Era, and it lasted 9 days. 9 days without firefighters. 9 days for the greatest city in the world to turn into ashes. After that, something strange happened. Nero showed no remorse. On the contrary, he started building a new palace, not a house, but the Domus Aurea, the Golden Palace. The fire consumed rooftops, temples, libraries, and stories that hadn't even been written down yet. While the crowd scattered in panic, rumors spread like soot. Amidst the chaos, whispers slowly shaped into a curse. He burned Rome to build heaven for himself. The anger grew as people realized they didn't just lose their homes, they had become the foundation of a gilded dream. A builder who once lived near the Palatine Hill wrote in his diary, "They say the new lake was made to raise carp for Nero, but I think it's where the corpse of my old house is buried." Emperor Nero was the one who burned Rome. Some claimed he stood on a balcony playing a lyre, singing about Troy, while the city blazed. No one dared confirm it. But right after the fire, he began building something called the Domus Aurea, the Golden Palace. Not a villa, not a mansion. It was a structure so extravagant, even modern people would find it hard to believe. Ceilings installed with rotating mechanisms, spinning like the cosmos. In the center of the ceiling, an open skylight sprayed fragrance onto banquet guests. Once, roses rained so heavily, a senator nearly suffocated during a meal. And every room was decorated with gemstones, seashells, golden paint, reflecting candlelight like you were feasting inside the belly of the sun god. Not a home, but a private world, in the heart of Rome. A private lake just for him. Hallways inlaid with real gold, ceilings covered in seashells and jewels, and a statue of himself, nearly 30 meters tall, staring straight into the public square. At the foot of that statue, those who had lost their homes were building straw and ash shelters. They looked up and saw the face of the man who had burned their houses, sculpted as a god. At that moment, the Roman Empire was no longer a dead republic. It had become a private living room, tiled in marble and lit according to the mood of one man. No one dared protest. No one dared ask Why? And those who dared disappeared. In the months after the fire, Nero began persecuting Christian communities, accusing them of setting the fire. They were crucified, burned alive, and used as human torches in the imperial gardens. Tacitus, a Roman historian, wrote, "It was an execution staged like a dinner party. People feasted under the light of burning men." It wasn't just Rome that burned, but also the conscience, scorched into charcoal, because Rome had become everything power ever dreamed of, a massive mirror reflecting only one face, and that mirror had a name, Colossus, a colossal bronze statue, nearly 30 meters high, placed in the square like a new god. Not a god of war, not a god of grain, but a god of himself, Nero, with a halo of light around his head like the sun, holding a scepter, looking straight into the crowd. It wasn't just a statue, it was a message in metal. I am immortal. And Rome is me. Later, the statue was moved, but its name, Colossus, survived, and from that name, the Colosseum was born. No one remembers the original name of the arena. They only know it stood next to that statue for so long that even its title was soaked in divine shadow. In the year 68, Common Era, Nero committed suicide. The empire fell into chaos. In less than a year, from June 68 to December 69, Common Era, 4 emperors rose and fell like dominoes. Galba was assassinated after 7 months of rule. Otho took his own life just 95 days later. Vitellius was dragged through the streets and publicly executed. 3 ghosts of power, each a spectacular failure before the name Vespasian emerged. Rome was thirsty for blood, but starving for leadership. And then, from the distant province of Judea, where a Jewish uprising was raging, appeared an old, practical, quiet general, Vespasian. He didn't step out from marble hallways, but from the battlefield, where dust, blood, and silence decided who lived. He had no royal blood, no love for gold, no passion for poetry, but he understood one thing. If you want to preserve Rome, you must return Rome to the Romans. The first thing he did upon taking power, halt all activities at Nero's Golden Palace, not demolish it, not use it. He filled in Nero's private lake, burying the ghost of ash-covered luxury. And right there, he declared, "We will build something for the people, a place for the crowd, not one man." Not long after, the idea of a public arena was born, and the funds for it did not come from the imperial treasury. According to many historians, the money to build the Colosseum came from spoils seized in Jerusalem, after Vespasian and his son Titus crushed the Jewish revolt in the year 70, Common Era. The treasures of the Jewish temple, once considered the holiest, were now used to construct a place of blood-soaked amusement in distant Rome. Blood from the east to feed the empire's laughter. A place that could hold tens of thousands. A place that would become the greatest center of entertainment and propaganda in the Roman Empire. From the emperor's private lake, a blood-drenched machine of a dead republic was about to rise. Vespasian would not live to see the arena completed. He died in the year 79, Common Era, just 1 year before the grand opening. No bronze statue was built in his honor, no gold-covered temple. But the Colosseum, a structure born of restraint, of war money, and of anonymous labor, still stands. No one remembers him for his robes, but everyone remembers him when they walk into the arena. The year was 70, Common Era. Rome began constructing the greatest public work in its history, on the site that once held Nero's private lake. This structure wasn't meant to hold books. It wasn't built to worship gods. It was built for blood. The Romans called it amphitheatrum. We call it the Colosseum. To build it, they had to dig 26 feet into the ground, diverting underground rivers from the Caelian and Esquiline hills. The foundation was poured from Roman concrete, a mix of slaked lime, volcanic ash, and rubble, a formula strong enough to hold for over 2,000 years. For every foundation block, dozens more of white-grey travertine stone were hauled in from the quarries of Tivoli, nearly 30 kilometers away. To transport them, they built an entirely new road for ox carts. Each cart carried 30 to 50 stone blocks. It's estimated that over 240,000 cart trips were needed. Sounds like a plan for a modern construction project. The only difference is, most of the laborers were slaves. 20,000 to 30,000 people. No contracts, no insurance, no names. Only two things they left behind: sweat and a foundation solid as rock. The Romans didn't just want something big, they wanted perfection. We don't know the name of the Colosseum's chief architect, but his fingerprints, and those of countless unnamed engineers, are pressed into every block. They didn't sign their names, they didn't build statues of themselves, but they calculated the arch curves for maximum support, designed corridors so that tens of thousands could exit in minutes. No shoving, no chaos. A building not meant to house, but to devour. The Colosseum was where Roman engineers pushed the limits of spatial logic and acoustics, using only stone, brick, and memory. Every tier, every step, every corridor followed the ancient golden ratio, 5:3. The seating arena formed an ellipse 188 meters long and 156 meters wide. But what mattered more was who sat where. The Colosseum didn't just assign seats, it assigned value to human beings. The lowest level, closest to the arena, was reserved for senators, nobles, and state priests. The middle tier, for free citizens, merchants, and retired soldiers. The highest level, for women, the poor, and freed slaves. Up there were no marble columns, no canopy, only dust, sun, and a view blocked by stone. The Colosseum was Rome in miniature, but stacked vertically like a pyramid. Each entry arch stood 7 meters high, spaced exactly 0.9 meters apart. There were 88 main arches, like the gaping mouth of a beast, waiting for the crowd to pour in. The tiers were built from the bottom up, but the roof and upper levels were constructed in parallel, thanks to Roman vaulting techniques. Because of this, the entire Colosseum was completed in under 10 years. In the early stage, before the Hippodrome, the underground complex was built, the Romans even used the arena as an artificial lake to stage naumachia, mock naval battles. The wooden floor was fully removed. Water was channeled in through underground aqueducts, filling the arena basin. Miniature warships, real sailors, and spectators could witness a battle of Salamis, right in the heart of Rome. Yesterday, it was a desert. Today, a sea. Tomorrow, a place where blood soaks into the sand. A feat never seen before, and never repeated since. Every stone, every corridor corner, every step was calculated so the crowd could cheer, clap, scream, without a single echo lost. The acoustics of the Colosseum made it feel like a giant speaker, with no electricity required. Compared to a modern stadium, the sound projection of the Colosseum still stuns today's engineers. No microphones needed, just the sound of sword-piercing flesh echoing against stone. This wasn't a building. It was a machine for amplifying emotion. A perfect stage where people came to watch others fall and rise as if they had been healed. The Colosseum wasn't just a place to watch. It was a place to see where you stood in the empire. Imagine you're a poor Roman woman, widowed, making a living washing clothes by the banks of the Tiber. There's a big match today, and you're given a free ticket, the kind reserved for those not worth worrying about. You carry your small child and climb nearly 200 stone steps to the fourth tier, the highest, farthest. The sun shines straight into your eyes. Smoke from food stalls drifts across your face. You sit between two men who smell like sweat steeped in vinegar. Down in the arena, two men are killing each other. People laugh, shout. The stone floor trembles. You can't see clearly. You only hear steel against flesh, and your child starts screaming in hunger. Welcome to the fourth tier. No service, no care, but you still have to clap. Seating, something that seems trivial, was arranged like a giant class chart of Roman society. Right on the first tier, closest to the arena floor, were the seats of senators, nobles, and high-ranking priests. They had stone chairs engraved with names, cushioned seats, canopies of fabric, and personal guards. The second tier was for the equestrian class, wealthy merchants, and mid-level officials. Wooden seats, modest, no cushions. The third tier for ordinary men, craftsmen, retired soldiers, small-time traders. They sat shoulder to shoulder, packed into unnamed rows. The fourth tier, highest, farthest, with no canopy, was for women, freed slaves, and those who belonged nowhere. From up there, the view was blocked by stone columns and rising dust. The sun burned straight into your eyes. No service, no attention. The higher you sit, the less you're allowed to see. Some scholars believe the Colosseum was the first to use architecture that reflected social hierarchy, not just horizontally, but vertically. The Roman authorities called it ordo, order. But to modern eyes, it was segregation. Seating at the Colosseum wasn't just for entertainment. It was a reminder who you were and that you should never forget it. Every step, every slab of stone whispered, "You were born to sit here, and only here." When you sit in the stands of the Colosseum, cheering with every slash, you never see what's moving beneath your feet. Hypogeum, an underground world, a maze of wood, stone, pulleys, and swallowed screams. The hypogeum was built after the arena was completed. 2 underground levels filled with holding cells, animal cages, elevators, traps, and scenery systems. There was no light down there, no wind, and no one stayed alive for long. A lion doesn't just appear in the middle of the stage, but no one knows how it was herded into the darkness, how long it was starved, or how many handlers it killed before ever seeing the arena. It was locked in a cage, mounted below the floor, and hoisted up by hand-cranked pulleys. The winches were powered by human strength, a system of more than 80 vertical lifts, each operated manually. The creak of wooden gears, men shouting down narrow corridors, signal drums, whistles, then boom. The trapdoor flies open, and a starving beast leaps out like it came from hell. The Colosseum was designed to make you think bloodshed was random, but everything was programmed. Below, workers labored in the dark like ghosts. They weren't allowed upstairs. They couldn't see the games. They never knew when it would end. They lived with the roars of animals, the stench of dung, of blood, of drums beating like murder commands. They slept on wooden floors, beside tiger cages. They ate leftovers that fell from above. And they were part of the machine. Not every slave was chained. Some were just bound by the ropes of pulleys. The hippodrome was the mechanical heart of the Colosseum, but it wasn't uniform. Each section had a purpose. Large predator pens were kept far from the rooms for rats and snakes to avoid panic. The fighters' preparation space was placed right beside the lift doors, so escape was never an option. And at the center was a network of passageways for scene changes, with hundreds of wooden props, fabric, fake rocks, hills, watchtowers. A place where humans weren't quite people, but parts of a conveyor belt. If the stands were the brain, then the hypogeum was the nervous system, relaying commands, triggering trapdoors, pumping blood and bone to the surface. And at the very core, a digestive system in silence, the stench of waste, iron cages, blood that never dried. The hippodrome was the empire's large intestine, where all emotion was processed, crushed, and pushed back up for the audience to consume, without ever knowing the source. And no one up there knew that every cheer was an echo of a scream from underground. If you think this was just primitive machinery, think again. The Colosseum was a stage with special effects timed to the second, run entirely by hand. Before Broadway had cranes, before Hollywood had CGI. At the hypogeum, blood, fire, beasts, and stagecraft were all programmed like a performance. Here, death wasn't sudden. It had a showtime, special effects, and someone to press the button. Before the Colosseum had a basement, it used to be a lake. Not a decorative pond, but an artificial beach, right in the heart of Rome. Yesterday, it was land. Today, it's water. Tomorrow, it will be blood. In the early years after the arena opened, around 80 to 85 Common Era, Emperor Titus and his successor Domitian held a series of mock naval battles called Naumachii. To do this, the wooden floor of the arena was completely removed. Underground water channels were opened, flooding the Colosseum's basin with clean water, deep enough for scaled-down warships to sail. The ships were real, the sailors were real, the battle orders were real. Only the death was supposed to be pretend. But sometimes it wasn't. Some of the rowers were slaves. They had never seen the ocean. But that day they wore armor, gripped oars, and died as if defending a fleet. I've never seen the sea, but I drowned in the applause of people who never knew my name. Spectators sat above sipping wine, watching ships crash into each other, soldiers fall into the water, spears pierce timber. It was a miniature battle of Salamis. But instead of honoring Greece, it entertained Rome. There were also Naumachii, staged in wider spaces, like Circus Flaminius. But only in the Colosseum, the political center, did the audience feel like they were sitting at Ostia's port, watching the world shrink into a blood-stained puddle. What their ancestors feared, the descendants turned into applause. The entire capital screamed for one soldier drowning in a fake lake. This was a technical marvel no less impressive than the arena floor itself. The filling and drainage system was specially designed, connected to the Cloaca Maxima, the city's main sewer. Water pressure was controlled manually using stone gates, flow-diverting vaults, and labor teams assigned to flush the system. Filling and draining for a naval battle could take hours, but the spectacle lasted centuries in memory. Historian Cassius Dio once wrote, "The audience believed they were sitting at the port of Ostia, not in Rome." But like all extravagance, it didn't last. When the Hypogeum was constructed in the late 1st century, a permanent wooden floor was installed. Naval battles were no longer held in the Colosseum. From a temporary lake, the Colosseum became a dry guillotine. No more ships crashing to the sound of cheers. No more sweating sailors gleaming under the sun. Because Rome no longer played with water, it became addicted to blood. From a city that once knew how to swim, Rome became a creature drowning in a thirst for human blood. And water was no longer used for performance, but for washing blood away. Because the Roman audience never stopped asking. Killing on land wasn't enough. They wanted to see it spill into the sea. Rome didn't need a reason to kill, just something new to clap for. There's one thing people rarely mention when talking about the Colosseum. It knew how to block the sun, not with a tiled roof, but with a massive sail. A flying canvas canopy called the velarium. The velarium was a fabric roof system stretched above the highest tier of the stands, shielding tens of thousands of spectators from the searing Roman summer sun. Sounds simple? Not at all. This system operated like a ship. The Colosseum had no ocean, but it had a whole fleet above its head. Each piece of fabric weighed hundreds of kilograms. They were fastened with coarse ropes, pulled through bronze anchor rings attached to the stone rim. To raise the sails, professional sailors were brought in from the Roman navy. They used the same techniques as on warships: tightening ropes, catching wind, anchoring lines, because no one else had the skill to handle a canvas sail, sometimes as long as 240 meters, and keep it stable in gusting wind. You thought they had retired, but no, they just traded the sea for the sky. For these sailors, it was a prestigious mission. They got to come to Rome, capital of the world, to stand above tens of thousands, and when the wind blew, they controlled the sky. One Roman historian once wrote, "Each time the velarium was raised, the Colosseum looked like a warship tilting upward on a sea of stone." Beyond spectacle, the velarium was a feat of engineering ahead of its time. The canopy system required hundreds of bronze anchor points, a multi-tiered rigging network, and carved stone grooves along the upper perimeter to keep the sail stable, even in heavy winds. At that scale, it's fair to say, the velarium was the largest canopy in the ancient world, the size of a modern football stadium. No motors, no steel, just bare hands, ropes, and a civilization built to block the sun. But don't assume it always worked perfectly. There were times when ropes snapped, winds flipped the canopy, and parts of it collapsed onto the third-tier stands. Many were injured. Some records say that during a performance under Emperor Domitian, a sudden storm forced the entire velarium to be torn down, and within minutes, the sun scorched the crowd mid-applause. For the sailors on the canopy, it was a nightmare. With no anchors, no steady footing, they had to either cling to ropes or jump into the framework as the wind howled. Some fell to their death during the performance. The Colosseum didn't just kill gladiators, it claimed the men who controlled the sky. Still, after every accident, the velarium was raised again, as if no one had fallen, as if the sky had never raged, because in the Roman mind, shielding the audience from the sun was more important than the lives of those who made it happen. A civilization that could raise sails above stone was also one that let sailors die unnamed. The Valerium wasn't just for shade. It was a symbol of control, to block sunlight when desired, to let it in when useful. A symbol of engineering power, running a sky sail by hand. A symbol of the empire, bending the heavens to serve blood sport. When the Valerium rose, the entire city knew, today there would be games. And when it rolled back, the wind swept through the empty arena, carrying the scent of blood not yet dry. The Colosseum wasn't just made of stone. It had wings, and it knew how to fly on the hunger of the crowd. Imagine you're a Roman citizen. In the morning, you stroll through the slave market, buy a bracelet, then stop by the bakery. At noon, you swing by the Colosseum, not to pray, not to learn, but to watch people die, and not just one. A full day of games could last from sunrise to sunset, divided into 3 distinct parts. Morning, executions. Criminals sentenced to death are thrown to lions, burned alive upside down, or forced to fight barehanded. Midday, break time, called pausa, but still filled with light entertainment, like parody executions. Afternoon, professional gladiators, real fighters, professionally trained, battling for glory and the chance to live. A beautiful day in Rome, unless you're the one in the cage. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena. It was a factory of emotions, industrialized. Human blood was the raw material. Excitement was the product. Every shout of "Jugula," "Kill him," was a flipped switch. The crowd didn't just watch. They decided the fate of the people below by turning their thumbs up or down, or sideways like a blade. The state didn't need to kill anyone. Just let the crowd choose and hand out free tickets. The fighters, called gladiators, came from many sources: captured slaves, prisoners of war, criminals redeeming themselves through combat, even voluntary freelancers, those who signed their bodies away for money, fame, or simply because they no longer cared to live. Sometimes you choose death, because out there you've already died. Fights weren't random action scenes. They had scripts, they had directors, they had event planners. Gladiators were divided into fighting schools. Mumio, heavy, large shield, short sword. Thrax, agile, curved blade, high leg guards. Retiarius, net, trident, no armor, just speed and strategy. Each match was designed like a military play. Romans loved contrast. Heavy versus fast, defense versus offense, brute force versus cunning. You weren't just watching a fight. You were watching Rome reflect on itself through every slash. And every match could end with a chosen death. If a loser fought bravely, the crowd might spare him. If he trembled, begged, or ran, the crowd would scream. And the emperor, or match official, would signal, thumb down, and the blade would go into the throat without missing a hair's width. Life in the Colosseum wasn't measured in breaths. It was measured in how badly the crowd wanted to see blood. For the government, the arena was a tool of pacification. Keep people inside the city, drain the rage of the poor, turn resentment into applause, and help everyone forget they were hungry, unemployed, or ruled by a madman. Bread, wine, and falling heads, Rome's triangle of political stability. And so, day after day, week after week, year after year, the Colosseum ran like a scheduled assembly line of slaughter. Not funerals, festivals, not war, entertainment. This wasn't a place of mourning. This was death's Disneyland. You ask, was there opposition? Yes, but it was buried under the cheering. A few philosophers wrote protest letters. A few writers offered satire, but no one heard them, because the acoustics at the Colosseum were too good. All you could hear was "kill more," and blood runs fast. Rome didn't need to convince anyone it was right. It just had to keep people drunk on blood, so they wouldn't want to think anymore. The Colosseum didn't die. It just changed roles, from a killing machine to a resting stop for pigeons, from the echo of steel blades to a selfie backdrop for tourists. But every stone step you walk on today was once soaked in blood. Every pillar you touch once echoed someone's final cry. You see stone, but the stone remembers. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 Common Era, the Colosseum gradually lost its roar. Part of it was struck by lightning and burned. Part of it was torn apart by earthquakes. Part of it was dismantled to build churches, castles, and walls, and the rest was slowly eaten by time. Yet it never completely vanished. The Colosseum didn't collapse. It just leaked, piece by piece, into the bones of Rome. For centuries, it served as a winter shelter for the homeless, a livestock pen, a wartime fortress, and even a public toilet. People didn't enter to watch gladiators, but to find shade, or a hidden place to relieve themselves. At one point, a pope declared the Colosseum holy ground, believing it to be the site where thousands of Christians were martyred. The truth, still debated, but symbols live longer than history. Rome no longer has an empire, but it still has the Colosseum, to remind itself it was once a crowned beast. Today, you can buy a ticket to visit the Colosseum for less than €20. Take the elevator to the 3rd floor. Hear the guide talk about the grandeur of ancient civilization. But if you stay behind, wait until everyone's gone. Sit on a worn stone and quietly look down at the sandy floor that once was. You might hear something else, not applause, but your own heartbeat when you realize you're sitting on a graveyard. The Colosseum no longer kills, but it leaves behind a question, slow burning, like a wound that never healed. If a civilization could turn death into a game, then are we, today, just playing differently? We call it a stadium, a reality show, an interactive experience. But how many times do we clap when someone gets eliminated, laugh when someone falls, or replay a fake death and forget that once it was just like that? The Colosseum isn't only in Rome, it's in the palm of our hands, every time we clap without a reason.